السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Welcome to another episode of Gems of the Heart, where we look into the ways and the means to purify our hearts. This heart that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it in such a way that salvation depends on what's the state of this heart, and the opposite of that, one's being wretched, one's destruction, one's punishment. It all depends on what's in the heart, because the heart is the king and the rest of the bodies are basically deputies for this heart. So the different parts of our body are deputies to the heart. The heart gives an order and then everything follows. As the ulama, the people of knowledge, they mention when they look into the ayat of the Quran and the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. And when we talk about the belief in the heart and the deeds done by the heart, it is something, as we heard it many times before, but it's important to be always reminded of this. It's something that we don't really have an excuse when it comes to the actions done by our hearts, because all of the human beings, the hearts are the same. We might be limited when it comes to our physical abilities. So if something, for example, in the deen of Islam is ordering us to give zakah, the order from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give zakah, it's an obligatory charity. It's not for everybody. It's for those who have enough wealth with the proper rulings and criteria that they become part of it, in which they would give a portion, a small portion of their wealth. But for those who are poor, there's no zakah on them. So the obligation of the zakah is not for everybody. Why? Because there are limitations into the physical life of the people. So the same thing, if a person, we are ordered to pray standing, as the Prophet ﷺ said, صَلِّ قَائِمًا. The obligatory salah, a person has to pray standing. But what if a person is not able to stand? Then he goes to the next stage, and that is فَإِلَّمْ تَسْتَطِعْ فَقَاعِدًا. As the Prophet ﷺ said, if you're not able to, then you pray sitting. And if a person is not able to pray sitting, فَإِلَّمْ تَسْتَطِعْ فَصَلِّ رَاقِدًا, or means if a person is not able to pray sitting even, he can pray laying down. So physical actions, we have limitations. So that's why the orders are accordingly. But when it comes to our abilities and the deeds done by the hearts, we're all the same. If a person is alive, that means we all have the same ability to do the deeds done by the heart. And that's why everybody should have these deeds done by the heart in the most perfect way. We should do the best we can to perfect it, and there's no such a thing, well, for a person to say, I cannot be sincere. I cannot have truthfulness in my heart with my act of worship. I'm limited. There's no way for me to have khushu' in the salah, right? Or to have a devotion in the salah. Yes, we always want to be perfecting these acts of worship, but we should not say that to be satisfied with being deficient in the acts done by our hearts. We can reach the highest level when it comes to the deeds of the heart. And if once that is perfect, then the physical actions will follow. The physical actions also will be perfect according to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us. So someone physically is not able to attain a certain level of goodness physically, meaning because he's not able to stand, for example, in the salah, because of what's in his heart of sincerity and truthfulness and so on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would perfect his rewards. His rewards are not anything less than those who are able to stand. And the same thing, someone is poor, if he does not have the ability to give charity, if his heart has the truthfulness, the sincerity, the good intentions and so on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward them as if he has the means to give charity and so on. That's why we need to focus on the deeds done by the heart and to perfect it, and to work on understanding and having the knowledge of the means to achieve this. And this is what we have been talking about for many of the episodes, and starting with matters of belief, how the aqeedah, how the sound belief would affect our hearts and purify our hearts and makes it easy for us to attain and to establish the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we talked about many different things, and we reached where we talk about the names and attributes of Allah, and we've been going through the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for many episodes. And one of these names, and we should have it one lead to the other. One name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and knowing it leads to the other. And that's one of the most effective way to purify ourselves, to make it easy for us to be sincere, to have the love of Allah, to fear Allah, to have the hope for the rewards from Allah, to be sincere in our actions, to have khushu' in the salah, to have devotion in our salah. As one of the statements, since just khushu' is mentioned, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, when he defined al-khushu' or devotion, he said, al-khawfu min Allah, to fear Allah. Even though al-khawf or to fear Allah is not necessarily the same as al-khushu', but when someone have the fear of Allah, that means he will devote himself in the salah. So how they are related to one another. So one of these names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and has a beautiful attribute, something that can affect our hearts, something that can purify our hearts and make our life completely different according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Jameel. And Al-Jameel is usually translated as the most beautiful. So this is one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that is mentioned in the sunnah of the Prophet alayhi salatu wassalam, that the Prophet ﷺ said in the authentic hadith, Inna Allah Jamilun yuhibbul Jamal. That indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Jameel. Jameel means beautiful, and He loves what is beautiful or what is beauty. So therefore we need to know what it means and how to live our life according to the belief in this name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. First of all, we know that as human beings, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us all human beings that are created to love what is beautiful. You know, human beings, even the word Jameel is a beautiful word. And no human being on the face of earth, he would say he doesn't like beauty. You know, but sometimes because of the corruption of the hearts of some of the human beings, they limit beauty to something, or maybe sinful acts or whatever. And they would even use the same hadith. Some people, they even use the same hadith of the Prophet ﷺ to approve for themselves to commit sins, to not to lower their gaze, for example, because they're looking at something beautiful, even if it's sinful. You know, so we have to basically not to follow our sinful desires, but to follow the revelation from Allah and understanding these meanings. So when we say indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Jameel, He's the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala, because beauty itself is created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if human beings can imagine every single beautiful thing on the face of earth, and we are limited because we only live on the earth. You know, if someone would think of what is beauty, because beauty is not physical beauty, this is only one type of beauty. There's the physical beauty, there is the non-physical beauty that is sometimes, you know, it is much stronger than the physical one. Actually, it's more important than the physical one. Because the physical beauty, when it comes to the human beings, for example, as an example, and we're going to this, why? Because many people, they limit their thinking of beauty to a human being. And that's wrong. It's limiting what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, created for us. But, you know, thinking of that as an example, the physical beauty is something that a person does not have a say in it. So how can that be basically what beautiful or what beauty is all about? A person does not choose to be physically beautiful. And that's it's a relative thing. To some people, beauty is this. Other people, beauty is something else. The color of the skin, the color of the eyes, whatever, you know, the physical attributes and shapes and so on. But the point here is, when it comes to our own choice, we don't have a choice. So therefore, what is even of a higher level of beauty is the non-physical ones, is the ones that we have a choice. When a person chooses to be beautiful, we're not talking about the physical beauty. We're talking about the manners, the proper belief, to be humble, to have, you know, good spirit towards others. You know, the beauty that a person has in his attitude, in his behavior, in his actions, is far more than the physical beauty. That's why people might be, they see something physical, beautiful, for example, and they might be impressed by it. But once they have a relationship, once they talk, once they interact with someone like this, and they have the worst manners and attitudes and so on, that beauty does not matter anymore. Right? Why? Because of the ugliness within. So, going back to the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Inna Allah Jamilun yuhibbul Jamal. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, indeed, He is the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He loves beauty. The name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Jameel, as it's mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is in all aspects of things. So nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the attributes of Allah that we believe in, all of them, as mentioned in the Quran and in the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And whatever we know in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without having the similarities between Allah and His creation, because nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful. No matter how much a person would imagine, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond that. And that's the same for all of the names and attributes of Allah. And just to get us to have some idea, when we think about Jannah, paradise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prepared for the believers, in it, the Prophet ﷺ said, no eyes have seen, no ears have heard, no hearts have ever imagined. If you just close your eyes and try to think of how beautiful Jannah is, and if you keep on imagining, to the ultimate way of imagining some forms of beauty and desires and all kinds of wealth, if we keep on talking about the beautiful things, and we do that for millions of years, we would never be able to attain exactly what people would see in Jannah. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, no eyes have seen. It's beyond our imagination. It's beyond what we think of even beauty. No hearts have ever imagined. We have an idea, we have names that you understand it because we have the like of it in this life with the limitation of this life. So when the Jannah, for example, have trees, we see trees on the face of earth, but is it the same? Nothing is, in similarities here, just the names. People would see it in Jannah, they would know that these are trees, but when it comes to the beauty of it, is nobody can ever imagine in this life how beautiful are the trees is, how beautiful are the human beings in the Jannah, how beautiful things are, life in Jannah, how beautiful it is. And we can go on and on of what is mentioned in details in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ about Jannah. Nobody can ever imagine how beautiful it is. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that created that beauty. So can anybody imagine how beautiful is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And then you add to this is, what is the ultimate joy for the people of Jannah, with all of what is mentioned about Jannah and the beauty of it. When you compare all of this beauty that we cannot even comprehend and imagine, compare that to the beauty of seeing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah. The believers, they will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a matter of belief. So the believers will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah, no doubt about this. And the beauty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way that the believers, they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would never consider anything in Jannah more beautiful than this. That's the most beautiful thing in Jannah, is to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That would not even give us an idea, because we cannot comprehend, but we cannot go beyond this. We cannot really imagine, and that's why this is such a great thing, and it's something that we need to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on this. And how can a person then deprive himself from attaining this ultimate beauty, and that is to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful. That's why it's the most joyful thing for the people of Jannah, when they get to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the believers, they see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah. So this is one aspect. Another thing is that we need to think about it when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can we, one of the things that we'll talk about it later inshallah ta'ala, how can we attain this level? Were we left like this just to think this way and that's it? No, if you truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the most beautiful, then follow what the Prophet ﷺ said of how to attain this ultimate joy in Jannah. And he said alayhi salatu wasalam, إِنَّكُمْ سَتَرَوْنَ رَبَّكُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. You will see your Lord in the day of Al-Qiyamah, in the day of resurrection. لا تضامون في رؤيته. You won't be having difficulties getting together close to each other to be able to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the same way that you would want to see something and there's a crowd that each one wants to try to get a share of what to see. You won't have any difficulties. لا تضامون في رؤيته. You would see him like you see the moon, how easy it is. But then the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, فَإِنِ اسْتَطَعْتُمْ. This is the way. If you are truthfully want to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and attain that beauty, the Prophet ﷺ said, فَإِنِ اسْتَطَعْتُمْ عَلَى أَلَّا تُغْلَبُوا عَلَى صَلَاةٍ قَبْلَ طُلُوعِ الشَّمْسِ وَقَبْلَ غُرُوبِهَا فَافْعَلُوا. Which means if you're able not to be overpowered and defeated, to pray a salah before sunrise, which is Fajr, and before sunset, which is Asr, then do so. To pray it, to perfect it, to establish the salah, to go to the masjid at Fajr time, to go to the masjid at Asr time, to pray in jama'ah if a person is away from the masjid, to make sure that we establish it in the most perfect way. And the hearts, if it has these, the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, would always remember that. When we find ourselves lazy or sleepy, or shaitan is whispering to us not to make it for Salatul Fajr in the masjid, or Salatul Asr, or whatever, and we have the means to do so, remember that if you truly believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, that He's the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you want to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment in Jannah, don't be lazy. Then take the means, seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that you will be among those who see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of resurrection. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful, and when it comes to the actions of Allah, and before that, His names and attributes. All of the names and attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the most beautiful. They are the most perfect. They are the most beautiful and perfect attribute ever, and nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there is no place on earth, there is no book, there is no revelation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed to any prophet that a person would find more of the names and attributes of Allah and talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like the final revelation from Allah to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So truly, sincerely, for those who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, human beings, those who claim to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whether they are Jews or Christians or whatever way they follow, right? If they truly love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one that created them, they truly love Him, human beings, they say that. They say that we love our Creator. They love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If they truly do, then let them follow Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would love them, as it's mentioned in the Quran. And there's no place on earth, there's nobody really get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like in the final revelation from Allah. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قُلْ إِن كُنْتُمْ تُحِبُّونَ اللَّهَ فَاتَّبِعُونِ يُحْبِبُكُمُ اللَّهِ. Say, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if you claim, if you say that we love Allah, then follow me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would love you. And when you follow the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you get to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His perfect names and attributes. And for people, they can examine that, they can see that. Look at your books, if you're a non-Muslim, look of how it mentions and it talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, about the Creator of the heavens and the earth. And how sometimes it's even because of how human beings altered the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it would even sometimes would talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a negative way, in a deficient way. And compare that to open the Quran and read the Quran. See what the Quran says about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Creator of the heavens and the earth. Perfect names and attributes. He is the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala because He is the Creator of the heavens and the earth. And that's one of the clear signs of how the Quran is miraculous. This is the book of guidance. There is nothing on the face of earth like the Quran. So therefore a person would follow the Quran, would follow the way the Prophet ﷺ, and these are facts. We're not talking just to be emotional or just to work on the emotions of the people. We're talking about truth versus falsehood, and for a person to see it for his own self. And put aside some of these baggages that we come with when we think about certain concepts and ideas and belief, like the ways of the forefathers, where you're born, where you live, the way that you have been raised and taught and so on. Because many times we get corrupted, and we should not have arrogance in ourselves. We should, all of us, want to seek the truth. And that's why when we read the Quran, put these things aside, our cultures, our color of our skin, our hatred to whatever we hate, all of these things. If a person is sincere, truthful, that he's seeking the truth, you want to know about the Creator of the heavens and the earth, read the Quran. You would never find the like of it in any other revelation and books that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even revealed before the Quran, or any work of a human being talking about the Creator of the heavens and the earth. And that's why human beings, they always have bad thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they become in state of forgetfulness. And when a person has this belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being Jameel, the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala, you would have another level, and I'm mixing the result and the fruit of this belief with what needs to be known first of the name itself, but it's overwhelming how much benefit and how much great meanings we can understand. So if a person has this true meaning in his heart, he would have another level of the dhikr of Allah. How to make remembrance of Allah. You're making remembrance to the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala. People, when they love something, they talk about it. When there's something so beautiful, people will talk about it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Jameel, the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala. So therefore people would make dhikr of Allah, remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala day and night. Talk about that and others, and continuing with the subject of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being Al-Jameel right after the break, so stay with us inshallah. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. Welcome back, and with the beautiful name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Jameel, the most beautiful. Something that needs a lot of reflection, because no matter what we think of what's beauty and what's beautiful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond that. It's something that beyond our imagination. He's the creator of beauty itself. So indeed, if a person really have the proper belief, his life will be totally different. Our life, our way of doing things on the face of earth will be totally different if we have this proper belief in the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Jameel. The last thing that we were talking about, as an example, the dhikr of Allah, to make remembrance of Allah. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful, and people, they would talk more and more of the things that they think is beautiful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful, and nothing is the like of Him. And He subhanahu wa ta'ala, just imagine that He said subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَاذْكُرُونِي أَذْكُرْكُمْ وَاشْكُرُوا لِي وَلَا تَكْفُرُونَ, which means, remember me. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. I will remember you. Remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would remember you. The most beautiful would remember you if you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Just that is amazing. It's something that we cannot even comprehend. You know, if someone would listen to the Sarir al-Aqlam, as one of the early generations of Islam, he said, if people would listen to the pen when it's writing, the fact that a person is making remembrance of Allah, you know, this is a good deed, and the pens are writing the deeds of the person. If a person just listen to the pen or to the pen's writing the remembrance of Allah, they will die out of longing and love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's overwhelming. So you can imagine that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most beautiful, the most high, He is mentioning His slave, the one that makes remembrance of Allah. If a person says Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, La ilaha illallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is mentioning you when you make remembrance of Allah. This is something that, how can there be anything more beautiful on the face of earth than the dhikr of Allah? That's why those who reach that level of purifying themselves, as the Prophet ﷺ, and he's the head of all of the pious and the righteous ones, the real joy of this life is in the remembrance of Allah. The most joyful moment for the Prophet ﷺ was to stand in the salah. As he said, and he would say to Bilal radiallahu anhu, أَرِحْنَا بِهَا يَا Bilal, give us the comfort, O Bilal, with our salah. And he said, وَجُعِلَتْ قُرَّةُ عَيْنِي فِي الصَّلَاةِ, the comfort of my eyes have been made in salah. And why not, when a person in salah, he's in state of what? Munajah. There's a secret talk between the person and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most beautiful subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the hadith about Surah Al-Fatiha, which is like a dialogue between the person and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But this needs a pure heart. And the way to purify our hearts is by understanding these names and attributes of Allah, and seeking help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to achieve these meanings in our hearts, and the outcome of it, and the result of it, and the effect of it in our hearts. Because of the time, otherwise if we talk about the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Jameel, it never ends. Because everything is a manifestation to this. When we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the most beautiful in His names and attributes, every name and attribute of Allah is the most beautiful. When we talk about the actions of Allah, which is another level of knowledge, all the actions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are beautiful beyond our imagination also. And the actions of Allah, when it comes to His creation, when it comes to the affairs of the human beings, because these are also the actions of Allah, it is the most beautiful. A person might say, but diseases and sicknesses and bloodshed and trials in this life, how can we see that this is a beautiful thing when it's all decreed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that decrees everything, and He only decree what is beautiful, and it's meant for a great reason. So therefore, if a person on an individual level, when a person sees in himself there is some form of suffering, sickness, loss of wealth, or fear or whatever things that we don't like on the face of earth. When a person is afflicted by this, there is rulings to be applied when it comes to our actions and so on. But there are certain meanings that should be present in the heart. And we have to detach sometimes what's in the heart and what physically we're supposed to do. For example, relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while taking the means. There's no contradiction here. You take the means, but don't let the physical means that you take, you rely on them. No, you rely with your heart on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the same thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that decreed, for example, for you to be sick. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful. And He wants to extract from you, as a result of the sickness, beautiful actions. Like to be patient for the sake of Allah. To seek rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Expiating the sins. Elevating oneself when it comes to being patient and to be pleased with Allah. Being pleased with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is not just when a person is having all kinds of physical goodness and happiness and so on. Otherwise, it's not for real, it's fake. It's all conditioned. So the real ones that are grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those who will be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at all levels. So when someone that you love so much, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that the love of the believers to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that is beyond anything, because nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they're pleased with anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decree upon them. And they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful in His names and attributes. He's the most wise. So why a person is afflicted with whatever he is afflicted with? For them to be believers, for them to be humble, for them to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at all conditions and all times, for them to forgive, for example, for the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be served, and so on. The same thing even when someone is faced with a tyrant, with someone that is oppressing him, with someone that is causing harm to him, individual level or whatever. We are tested by this to extract from ourselves the most beautiful actions, and not to act in a foolish way or an ignorant way. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the believers, as it's mentioned in Surah Ash-Shura, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the believers, وَإِذَا مَا غَضِبُوا هُمْ يَغْفِرُونَ. When they are angry, when they got angry, they forgive. It's amazing how the two are put together. The believers, they have in their hearts the belief in Allah, the names and attributes of Allah. So when they're angry, people would think, if I'm angry, if someone makes me angry, people, some of them, they would act foolishly, and they would revenge, and they would transgress and commit injustices and so on. Whether people had treated them with injustice or not, it's not permissible to oppose injustice and to push away injustice with another injustice. So some people, they act like this. And other people, they might, suppress their anger because they don't have a choice, because they're weak. But for the believers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said when they're angry, when people get them angry, they pardon and they forgive. Unless it's not a good thing to forgive in a certain situation where the evildoer, this can cause him to do even more and more evil. So, but for the most part, this is the first thing that comes into the hearts of the believers. How can I forgive? Why is that? Why is this effect is in the heart? Why is it this is so much difficult in our hearts? Because if we really believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the right way with His names and attributes, we would get that feeling because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised it. Especially those who are close to us. It's amazing that how people, they do not forgive when it comes. We're not talking about their enemies. We're talking about one's wife, or a wife to her husband, or children, or parents, or relatives, or friends, or the same people that pray with one another in the same line next to them in the masjid. Things that are done for the sake of Allah together, and they would start to have hatred towards one another. They would be doing all kinds of good to one another, but once one makes a mistake, does not fulfill the rights of his brother, even causing harm or whatever, the first thing is, I want my rights back. I would never forgive you. All of these types of things. Why? Because the hearts are contaminated. There are diseases in the heart, and we think that there's nothing wrong. Of course there's nothing wrong for a person to ask for his rights and so on. But where is the level of these hearts when it's attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, especially those who are close to us? Forgive, pardon. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praise those who forgive and pardon, and it's a result of the effect of believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, And one of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Jameel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the word Al-Jameel is mentioned in the Quran when it comes to the actions of the believers. One of which is فَاصْفَحِ الصَّفْحَ الْجَمِيلِ, which means pardon a beautiful pardoning. And that's to the Prophet ﷺ dealing with the disbelievers. But if you look at the ayah, the beginning of the ayah, it says what? وَمَا خَلَقْنَا السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. We did not create the heavens and the earth and what's between them except by the truth. وَإِنَّ السَّاعَةَ لَآتِيَةٌ فَاصْفَحِ الصَّفْحَ الْجَمِيلِ. And indeed the hour is coming, the day of judgment is coming, so therefore pardon the most beautiful pardoning. It's all together. So when a person doesn't find in himself that he wants to pardon, and this is to the Prophet ﷺ facing his worst enemies in Mecca, and we're saying, okay, if it's not that level, we're talking about those who would say, I find it difficult to forgive or to pardon my husband or my wife or this or my brother for the sake of Allah in the masjid or this or that, right? If a person fulfill the beginning of what's mentioned in the verse and remembering the names and attributes of Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, وَمَا خَلَقْنَا السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ, we did not create the heavens and the earth and what's between them إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. If you believe that this has been created by the truth, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator of all things, and it's created by the truth, that means it's created for a reason. And the reason of it is to establish the truth. Why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the heavens and the earth? Why are we created? To worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. This is the haqq, this is the truth. And to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not according to what we desire, but according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. So if a person has this clear in himself, and وَإِنَّ السَّاعَةَ لَآتِيَةٌ, and the hour is coming, the day of judgment is coming, having the certainty in the day of judgment and the hereafter, that's the everlasting life. If a person has this and it's always present with him, and having this certainty in his heart, how easy it is then after that to pardon. Definitely it's the most easier one. Why? Because a person would know that if he pardon, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will pardon him. The reward, the jaza' min jins al-amal, the reward or the recompense is from the same sort of deed that a person do. If you forgive others, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would forgive you. And who among us as human beings does not need the forgiveness from Allah? We know that as a fact, if we are not forgiven, we will be punished in the hellfire. Can someone claim that he is sinless? Never ever committed a sin in his entire life, knowingly? Nobody. After the Prophet ﷺ, everybody is sinless. So if it's not the forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if it's not the mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're all ruined and we're all in the hellfire, unless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us. And one of the ways to achieve that is to forgive others, to pardon others. So when we look into these actions and to these means and understanding, and how that would bring so much happiness in our life with knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with His names and attributes, then things becomes easy in our life. وَإِنَّ السَّاعَةَ لَآتِيَةٌ فَاصْفَحِ الصَّفْحَ الْجَمِيلِ. What is the beautiful pardoning? When you pardon, don't remind the people of your favor that you forgave them. Because sometimes a person would forgive a moment of goodness, somebody reminded them, so they forgive and they pardon and so on. But then after that, the one that you pardoned and the one that you forgave, he committed the same thing again. Or he said something, or he did not react in the proper way. Or for no reason, you would remind that person of your favor. Or you would remind them of their harm. Remember when you did this and I forgave you. That's not a beautiful pardoning. A beautiful pardoning, that means you don't remind the person of your favor. You don't take it back. You don't act in a negative way, but rather to leave it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Without anything for your own personal benefit even. You make it only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking rewards from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hereafter. If we truly love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you want your reward from the most beautiful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also mentioned, when it comes to our actions, the word Al-Jameel. And He said that to the Prophet ﷺ and for all of us. فَاصْبِرْ صَبْرًا جَمِيلًا. Have a beautiful patience. When you're patient, make your patience a beautiful one. How can you make something bitter to be beautiful? Right? Sabr or patience is bitter. And it comes from the plant that is in the desert that is so bitter, whether it's the cactus or the like of it. It's so bitter you cannot even eat it and you'll be very amazed and happy when you eat it. But this is where the root meaning comes from it. So a sabr, or to be patient, is not something that is a desirable thing. Right? Nobody likes to face difficulties. But part of life is that for you to attain delight and happiness, you have to go through difficulties. Otherwise, nobody will do anything. If anyone, as Umar ibn Abdul Aziz radiallahu anhu, he said something in the meaning of which, if anyone on the face of earth, they face difficulties in a matter and they leave it because it's difficult, nobody on the face of earth will be attaining anything. Nobody will do anything. Nobody will be in their profession unless they have to go through some difficulties, some challenges. But what keeps them going to be successful is the hearts attached to the end result. Whether it's a deficient one, like the worldly gain and so on. But this becomes an evidence for people to see for themselves that it's attainable. And that life and the delight in life does not come with delight and relaxing and so on. Laziness does not make a person successful. And when we talk about success, of course, the real success is in the hereafter. But even in the limitations of the human being, for someone to be on a high level in this life of whatever profession that he's in, he has to go through some struggle and patience and so on. And the same thing when it comes to attaining the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you're patient, right, about something that you don't necessarily desire as a human being, have a beautiful patience. That means don't complain. That's basically what it means. Like the patience of Yaqub alayhi salam, the father of Yusuf, that he loved his son in such an amazing way, that he loved him to the extent of which, that in the beginning of the surah, when in the beginning of the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, when the brothers of Yusuf, they wanted to take Yusuf to throw him into the well. So when they came to their father and they asked him to take Yusuf with them and for him to play and so on, the father of Yusuf alayhi salam, he said, إِنِّي لَا يَحْزُنُنِي أَن تَذْهَبُوا بِهِ. He said that it makes me sad that you take him away. Just for his son to depart from him, to be taken away for a few hours, it makes him so sad and grieve and so on. So you can imagine what happened to him, that he was deprived from his son many, many years, when he was child till he became in such a place of authority. So most of the life of Yusuf alayhi salam, his father did not enjoy the presence of his son, that he loved him dearly. So you can imagine the level of sabr and patience that he had in himself. And this is the beautiful sabr. Sabr that has no complaints. A person does not keep on complaining. Someone is sick and he keeps on saying, I'm in pain, I'm suffering, I'm this and that. Makes everybody around them, having this negative feeling. We're not talking about someone talking to his doctor, for example, explaining where the pain is and so on. This is permissible, so that they would be able to figure out exactly what he's suffering from, so that medicine is taken in the proper way. If there's need of surgery, taking exams, whatever there is. But we're talking about complaints, whether it's from the behavior of the people, from one's suffering, a person always complaining about how poor he is, poverty, complaining about the situations in the world, complaining about how the Muslims in the world and the affairs of the Muslims, not having good hope and good thinking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's different than stating the reality and the facts of life so that we can act in the proper way, but complaining. There's no patience. It's just a person is complaining, right, and without enduring patience. So to have a beautiful patience as a result of believing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful, is to have patience without complaints. That does not bring any benefit. And the like of this, even when there is a divorce between a husband and his wife, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in the Quran to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that, and to the believers, that that if you divorce them, make the departing a beautiful one. Don't make it with courts and anger and disputes and children suffering. And so if it's the last resort and there's nothing works whatsoever, then at least make it a beautiful one, not something that would bring all kinds of harm. There are so many different levels of benefits and actions, and really we cannot fulfill the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the most perfect way. We are deficient, and if we talk about just one name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need forever time, because nothing is the like of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the point here is If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most beautiful, I even finished the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that when a man asked the Prophet ﷺ, that a person would love for his clothing to be clean and his shoes to be nice and so on. Is that arrogance? When the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna Allah Jameel yuhibbul Jamal, the Prophet ﷺ said to him, no, this is not arrogance. And he said to him, Inna Allah Jameel yuhibbul Jamal. Allah is beautiful, He loves what's beautiful. But al-kibr or arrogance is batar al-haq wa ghamt al-nas, is to reject the truth and to look down at people. So part of that is that we love things that are beautiful. So to have nice clothes, to have nice smell and things like this is all good as long as it's according to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us, not in a sinful way. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the reality of what we heard and to make us among those who have the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to give us steadfastness on the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.